What I'm going to suggest to you today is that the future of value creation lies in something that I would call social investment banking. What I mean by this is the conscious use of legal financial tools to restructure markets. In particular, to do that, so you bring together politics, civil society, and business in large-scale transactions. What's driving this is the sustainability crisis. And what it does is that it picks up on some of the skills we recognize from conventional investment banking. But it adds to that, I think, three skills. First, the ability to work across sectors, the ability to coordinate these sectors, coordinate and translate the values between these sectors. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, the ability to build trust between these sectors. But first, what do we actually mean when we say value creation? I will suggest a very intuitive definition of value creation. I mean, value creation is being helpful. People who are helpful, organizations that are helpful, create value. Those who are very helpful create a lot of value. And this is different from getting paid. I think we all have the sense often that we're much more helpful than we get paid for. But you can also get paid when you're not helpful. I know this firsthand because I used to build risk models like many of you do, I'm sure, for banks. And we got paid a lot for building risk models for banks. The only problem was that soon after we left, at least 3 of the banks I built risk models for collapsed. Probably because I was not very good at building risk models. But I like to think that there was something more going on there. And I think it has to do with the confounding of being useful and getting paid. I think that confounding was at the heart of the financial meltdown. And I think guys like you have to be exceedingly cautious. Because if you get paid a lot, it's very easy that you never get to the question, am I being helpful? So my interest is, how can we be helpful? And I come to that question from the perspective of the big global challenges that we are facing, the big problems in the world. Because if you want to be helpful, you better be where the big problems are. You can't be very helpful if you're dealing with problems that no one really cares about. And how to be helpful, of course, also depends on who you are. Not everyone can be helpful in the same way. I think that's the definition of being helpful. You're helpful to someone else. And we listen today to a lot of people who are doing very exciting and often cutting-edge work on the ground, trying to make markets work in more effective ways. That's not the perspective I will take. They will speak about that. I will take the perspective of the enabling structures that are needed in order to liberate the force that many of these people you meet today stand for. What are the legal and financial, the engine of change that needs to be put in place in order for these people to do the work? This is what I call social investment banking. The conscious use of legal and financial tools for a political or social purpose. And I think you guys are brilliantly equipped to move in and take that space. Like in normal investment banking, this is where the high leverage for change is. And the good news and the bad news, I suppose, is that no one is doing this yet. So let's give me an example. And this comes from a real transaction that I was part of incubating and structuring, and it's from here in India. It refers to the market of efficient stoves and solar lanterns. And I'll say a bit about the market and then move on to the structural intervention that I was pushing. So very basically, this is about getting simple technologies to rural women in India on a large scale. You have efficient stoves and solar lanterns. What essentially does is that the stove takes a closed combustion chamber, which reduces the flow of oxygen to the fire when women cook. This means that the combustion gets more efficient. You roughly halve the consumption of wood energy. You halve the emission of carbon dioxide. And you halve the time the woman needs to spend collecting wood. Similarly, lights takes a dark room becomes a lit room. It helps people study longer. It helps women do productive work longer. These are undoubtedly very good examples of value creation. The question we asked, so how can you do this on a large scale? It's estimated that you need to get roughly 800 million of these technologies to women around the world. That's ballpark $100 billion economic opportunity. But the markets don't work. I'm using this as a generic example, but I'll say something more specifically about how we try to overcome it. So what is the generic problem? I'm suggesting that you can think of this merely as a standard case of getting useful technologies, business interest, to the economic and social needs. Yeah? You can also think actually of urban infrastructure, how you get urban infrastructure to people in urban areas. Greening buildings, greening houses, a huge market opportunity. So the seemingly simple problem is, how do you take simple technologies and give them to the people who need it? Unfortunately, that is not such an easy problem. That's why the markets don't work. Often what happens, to caricature it, is that business comes along and says, the women come along and say, well, those products look interesting. They're not quite what I think I need, and they're quite expensive, so, well, no, I don't think so. Business comes and says, well, this looks like an interesting opportunity, but I don't really see that there's any demand emerging yet. So, well, I'll come back and look at it when the market has matured. And the deal dies. What then might happen is that the banks come in, financial interests come in, and they say, well, what we'll do is that we'll lend the money to the women, microfinance, we'll lend women the money, and they can buy the products and the market will emerge. And then, maybe because they have my risk models in the back of their mind, go back and say, well, actually, this has never been tested before. These women, can they really be banked? I want a security, and I want quite high interest rates, and the deal dies. At this stage, politics might jump in. Donor agencies or international institutions come in and say, well, what we're going to do is we're going to give these women a grant. Let's give them a grant so they can buy 1,000 units, yeah, and take it to the village, and the market will begin to emerge. Well, what often happens is, as a result, that 1,000 substandard products are given to women who are not quite sure that they need them and have no incentive to maintain them. And unfortunately, the project doesn't die, but people try to forget about it. My point is not that these interventions are not important. That's not my point. My point is that on their own, these single pieces of interventions are not nearly as helpful, as value creating, as they could be. And what I'm suggesting is that we need to think of this problem more in these terms. How can you create the legal and financial structured product that is able to integrate and coordinate these interventions so as to get much more efficacy in the way that you address the problem? So what did we do? Let me give you the practical example. So the insight we came with was that the products are emerging, but you need large organizations able to distribute this at scale. By definition, when the markets don't work, the market mechanisms can't do that. So we tried to link up complementary organizations. And we brought Self-Employed Women's Association, and phenomenal Indian organization, 1.3 million women, the poorest of the poor, a cooperative. We brought businesses into this. We brought a bank, and we brought the IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank, and 2 additional donor agencies, in a common process that would allow us to put gradually the complementary pieces together in order for a new product to emerge. What this resulted in was a new legal vehicle in the middle, which could be underwritten by a 50% pari passu guarantee from the World Bank, which in turn was shared with 2 other donor agencies. This allows a AAA rated loan from a commercial bank in India of $22 million, which is small in global terms, but huge in this market. So $22 million, AAA rated, to be lent to this new entity. This, in turn, allows you to put an RFP in the market of such a scale that you begin to generate the R&D and the dynamic impact on the market that it needs. So 200,000 units, solar lanterns, and efficient stoves. Yeah. These are then lent, sold with a vendor financing model to the women who repay them over 3 years. Crucially, though, the scale of the intervention allows you to begin to look at the carbon credits. And out of this emerged a carbon pool of about 1 million tons of carbon dioxide. That's the amount of carbon dioxide saved by this product, by this intervention. That, in turn, can be allowed by the banks as a first loss guarantee. So what I'm saying, and that's the illustration of what I call social investment banking, is the idea of understanding the kind of inputs needed and coordinate their implementation in a way so you create a systemically more efficient solution. So why do I call this social investment banking? Well, I think some of the aspects in this intervention are very much like investment banking. Yeah? It's the ability to spot a suboptimal, inefficient market structure, to spot synergies by realigning incentives in the marketplace. But it's different in the sense that you need, crucially, to bridge into the civil society and into politics. The reason for this is that when you look at the sustainability space, the emergence of these economic opportunities will almost invariably be politically underwritten in one way or another. So you need the ability to spot the synergies and to bridge into these other sectors. You need the ability to coordinate these, which requires that you're able to work with politics and civil society. It requires you to be able to understand deeply the values of these different sectors. Because only if you understand the values of these sectors are you able to perform the final, most crucial function, which is to build the trust between these parties so that this coalition holds together. Investment banking is kind of set up to function without trust. In this new landscape, trust becomes the essential ingredient to make these markets come together in the right way. So why does this matter? What's the larger point on this? Well, social investment banking, as I use the term, tries to do two things. It tries to find a way whereby you put many pieces together at the same time in a coordinated way. Going back to the problem, we're facing the imperative of a very radical transition. In any radical market shifts, there's never one piece missing. There are many pieces missing. Furthermore, as I said, it essentially requires a bridging of these different sectors. The bigger point. About 25 years ago, Gro Harlem Brundtland came out with the Brundtland Report. In that report, she coined the term sustainable development. Quite an intuitive idea. It essentially said, don't consume beyond your means. But it added, importantly, the idea that you have to understand means in financial and in environmental and in social terms. So that's the modern definition of sustainable development. Don't consume beyond your means and understand your means in these three terms. This idea has not worked. There has been no big, large-scale practical implementation of this idea. The indicators are going in the wrong direction. I'm suggesting to you that this has not worked for a very specific reason, which is that there hasn't been a practical mechanism for coordinating and translating these domains of value: politics, civil society, and business. There hasn't been a way of translating and bringing these together. And how can you do a transaction that balances the political, the financial, and the social interest if you don't have a means of bringing these actors together and translating their values? So in short, I'm suggesting that social investment banking tries to address this at its logical core. This also is where I believe that the big leverage is. And the good news and the bad news is that no one is doing it, and I'm suggesting you should. Thank you.